It was a quiet morning in the small coastal town of Brookhaven. The sea mist hung low over the docks, like a thin blanket that softened the bright morning sun. The waves rolled gently against the wooden pier, creating a peaceful rhythm that filled the air with the scent of salt water. The sound of seagulls calling echoed across the water, adding to the tranquility of the place. A soft breeze swept through, tugging at the strands of hair that escaped under the brim of the worn cap that Mary Thompson always wore. She was no stranger to the sea. It had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. To anyone who looked at her, Mary was just another ordinary woman. She was an older lady, with silver hair tied back in a neat bun, and hands that bore the marks of hard work. She wasn't tall, nor was she particularly striking. Her clothes were simple: a faded blue shirt, old but well-kept pants, and sturdy boots that had seen countless days on the rough wooden docks. A basket of freshly caught fish sat beside her, the sea air filling her lungs as she took a deep breath. The work was hard, but it was honest, and Mary took pride in it. She had always been a woman of few words, letting her actions speak for themselves. Mary adjusted the cap on her head, a small but purposeful gesture. She smiled softly at the fishermen around her. They all knew her, and though they didn't speak much, there was a quiet understanding between them. She had been working these docks for years, and in that time, she had earned the respect of the town without ever asking for it. But it wasn't something she demanded. She never sought attention. She didn't want the spotlight. Yet, in the eyes of those who truly knew her, there was something special about Mary, a quiet strength that set her apart from others. It wasn't something you could easily put into words. It wasn't in the way she carried herself or in the way she looked at people. It wasn't something obvious, like the flash of a bright smile or a powerful handshake. It was something deeper. A kind of unspoken power, hidden in the calm of her movements, the steady way she held her gaze, and the respect she quietly commanded without even trying. People often said that Mary was just a simple woman. But in the small town of Brookhaven, people didn't always see the whole story. They saw the surface. They saw the humble mother and fisherman's wife, never suspecting that there was far more to her than met the eye. Those who passed through town or bought fish from her never knew her true strength. They never knew what she had endured. And they certainly didn't know what was still hidden beneath her calm exterior. Mary was a woman of many layers, but few ever got close enough to see them all. For those who knew her well, they respected her more than they even realized. It wasn't just because of the years she had spent on the docks, or the way she always seemed to have a kind word for everyone, even on the toughest days. It was because of something more: a quiet power that didn't need to be flaunted. It was the kind of strength that made people pay attention when she spoke, even when her words were few. But there was something else, something deeper, something that Mary had kept hidden for most of her life. It was a part of her past, something she never talked about. She had learned long ago that some stories were best kept to yourself. After all, people didn't need to know everything about you. Sometimes, it was safer to let them believe you were just like everyone else. And for years, Mary had been content with that. She had built a life here in Brookhaven, surrounded by the people she cared about, and she didn't need anything more. She didn't need anyone to understand her past. But deep down, there were times when she couldn't help but think about what she had left behind. The life she had chosen to forget, the life she had never fully explained to anyone. Mary Thompson wasn't just the hard-working mother of a fisherman. She wasn't just the woman who lived quietly among the people of Brookhaven. No, she was the mother of someone much, much more. Someone whose name carried weight, whose presence was known across the world, even though the world never knew the story behind it. Her son, Luke Thompson, had grown up right here in Brookhaven. He had been like any other young boy, running through the streets, playing with his friends, and helping his mother on the docks. He was a good boy, smart, brave, and full of promise. He had always been strong, even as a child. He had a quiet confidence, just like Mary. They understood each other in ways that most others couldn't. But Luke had dreams that went beyond the small town. Dreams of adventure, of serving something bigger than himself. It was when he turned 18 that Mary knew something was changing. Luke had enlisted in the Navy, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to do more than just live a quiet life in a small town. At first, Mary had been proud. She knew that Luke had the heart of a hero. But as the years went by, and Luke's letters grew fewer and farther between, she began to worry. She heard the stories of the men who came back, broken in body and spirit. And as much as she wanted to keep Luke close, she knew he had made his choice. He had gone to become part of something much greater than herself, something that would take him far away from the peaceful life they had shared in Brookhaven. Luke had gone on to become a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite and dangerous forces in the world. It wasn't the kind of thing that Mary could ever openly talk about. Not because she was ashamed, but because the world had no idea what it meant. Being a Navy SEAL was something extraordinary, something most people couldn't understand. It was dangerous, and it was filled with sacrifice. But it was also something that had shaped Luke into a person beyond what anyone could have imagined. He had trained for years, pushed himself beyond the limits of normal human strength and endurance. He had become a force of nature, someone who could do things most people couldn't even dream of. And yet, despite all of this, Mary had never shared it with anyone. She didn't want to. Luke had made his choice to serve, and she respected that. She was proud of him, but she didn't need to tell the world. The town of Brookhaven didn't need to know about the covert missions, the dangerous operations, or the countless lives Luke had saved. To them, he was just Luke Thompson, the quiet fisherman's son who occasionally visited home. But in her heart, Mary knew who her son really was. It wasn't the fisherman who saw her strength. It wasn't the town that respected her quiet power. The truth was, Mary had a secret that no one else could know, a secret that, if revealed, could change everything. The peaceful rhythm of the coastal town was always broken by the loud roars of the fishing boats as they returned from their day at sea, unloading their catch to the eager market on the docks. The fishermen knew the routine. Their work was hard, long, and honest, and Mary had been there, alongside them, for as long as anyone could remember. Every fisherman knew the routine, knew the hours, and knew the effort that went into the work. But it was different for Mary. She didn't simply work, she lived the rhythm of the sea. She understood its moods, its tides, its storms. It wasn't just a job to her, it was a part of her, deeply ingrained in every fiber of her being. As she stood there, day after day, pulling fish from the sea, interacting with the market vendors, and greeting the townspeople, she couldn't help but smile at the simplicity of it all. Brookhaven was small. Too small, some might say, for anyone to dream of much beyond the borders of the town. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where nothing was ever truly a secret. It was a place of calm, of routine, and of a quiet, sometimes monotonous existence. But Mary knew better. She knew that the town's placid surface didn't reveal the depths hidden beneath. There were secrets here. There were histories that were never told. Her life was evidence of that. Mary's life had been shaped by these waters, these docks, and the people who walked by them. She'd seen many faces come and go, some full of promise, others broken by the very same sea that had given her the strength to survive. She knew the hardship that came with the life of a fisherman. She knew the struggles, the heartbreak, and the quiet satisfaction that came from a day's work well done. But even as she stood among them, working side by side with the fishermen, she knew that her story was not like theirs. When Luke left for the Navy, she had felt a deep pain that she had never fully expressed. It was a mother's fear, the fear of losing her child to a life far too dangerous to bear. But Luke had made his choice. He had enlisted in the Navy, driven by a sense of duty, a desire to prove himself, and perhaps to escape the quiet town where he had been raised. Mary had watched him grow from a curious child into a determined young man, and when he left, she knew he was ready for something bigger than Brookhaven. What she hadn't expected was how much that decision would change their lives. She never told the people of Brookhaven about Luke's true path. No one in the town knew that her son had become a Navy SEAL, an elite force trained for the most dangerous and secretive operations in the world. No one knew that Luke had faced death countless times, that he had stared into the face of danger, and come out on the other side a different person. Mary had kept this part of her life a secret. Not out of shame, but because it was not something the town could understand. They didn't need to know. What mattered was that Luke had followed his heart, and she had to respect that. But even though Mary never spoke of it, she knew. She knew what he had done, and she carried that knowledge with her like a quiet strength. As she worked the docks, she often thought of him, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and hoping that he was safe. Sometimes, she would hear rumors of Navy SEAL operations, secret missions that the government didn't speak of, and her heart would race with worry. But Mary didn't show her fear. She couldn't. She couldn't let the world see the turmoil that sometimes tore her apart inside. The years went by, and Luke's visits became fewer and farther between. There were letters, always handwritten and full of love, but they grew more scarce as the missions took over his life. There was no time for visits when there was a war to fight, when there were lives to save, when the world's most dangerous enemies had to be dealt with. And so, Mary waited. She waited quietly, just like the waves that crashed on the shore, always there, always steady, always waiting for the moment when Luke would come home. But then, as fate often does, things took a turn. Life, as it always does, brought a new challenge to Brookhaven, a challenge that would force Mary's past, her hidden life, and the strength she had kept buried deep inside, to come to the surface. It all started on a day that seemed as normal as any other. Mary had just finished unloading a fresh catch of fish, her hands sore from the weight of the baskets, when the rumble of motorcycle engines interrupted the calm of the town. The sound was loud and menacing, cutting through the peaceful air like a sharp blade. It wasn't the usual sound of a local fisherman's boat coming in. No, this was something different. The roar of engines grew louder as a group of bikers, strangers, pulled into Brookhaven. Their bikes were loud and their riders were rough-looking, with tattoos and leather jackets that screamed trouble. The bikers didn't pay much attention to the people around them as they parked their motorcycles near the docks. They had come for something. Mary watched as they swaggered toward the fishermen, making rude comments and acting like they owned the place. It was the leader of the group, Blake, who caught Mary's attention. He was tall and muscular, with a dark beard and a smirk that could melt steel. His eyes gleamed with arrogance as he strutted around, barking orders to his gang. He seemed to think that no one in the small town of Brookhaven could stand up to him. He was wrong. Blake and his gang started causing trouble, mocking the fishermen, pushing people around, and creating an atmosphere of fear and discomfort. At first, the townspeople tried to ignore them, hoping they would leave quickly. But Blake and his gang weren't interested in leaving. They were there for a reason. They were there to make a statement. And then they turned their attention to Mary. Blake swaggered up to her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Hey there, Grandma," he sneered. "You the one who sells the fish around here? Or are you just another old woman trying to make a living?" Mary felt a surge of anger. But it wasn't the kind of anger that made her shout or lash out. No, this was different. It was the kind of anger that came from years of experience, years of being underestimated. Years of people thinking they could push her around because she was just a quiet, older woman who worked on the docks. She straightened her back and met Blake's gaze with calm defiance. "I'm just a woman trying to make a living," she said quietly, her voice steady. Blake smirked, clearly not taking her seriously. "Well, I don't like the way you're looking at me." Maybe you need to be taught some respect. As he took a step closer, Mary's heart raced. But her feet didn't move. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her. She had lived through much worse. Little did Blake know, the woman he was mocking was not just any ordinary fisherwoman. She was someone far more dangerous, though he would not find that out until it was too late. And as Blake leaned in, the sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. It wasn't the roar of a motorcycle like Blake's. No, it was something else. Something that would make Blake's blood run cold. The tide was about to change. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm cloud about to burst. Mary could feel every muscle in her body tighten as Blake's sneering face loomed closer. But she didn't back down. Her hands remained steady as she wiped her fishing net, her gaze locked on him like a hawk eyeing its prey. Blake's smirk widened as if he thought her silence was a sign of weakness. He straightened up, looking back at his gang. "What do you think, boys? Think she's scared of us?" The bikers laughed again, their voices blending with the hum of the nearby waves crashing against the pier. The sound was a sharp contrast to the peace Mary had cherished in her small town. For years, Brookhaven had been a haven of quiet mornings and friendly neighbors. The arrival of the bikers was like a thorn in the side of the town's simple way of life. Mary finally broke her gaze, turning to reach for a bucket of fish at her side. "You want fish? Here." She tossed a large trout onto the wooden counter in front of him. $5. Take it or leave it." Blake looked down at the fish, his smirk fading for just a moment. It was as if he hadn't expected her to treat him like any other customer. For a second, he didn't know how to respond. But then, he picked up the trout and held it up to the sun, examining it like he was some kind of expert. $5, huh, he said, shaking his head. "Seems overpriced to me. What do you think, boys?" The gang erupted in laughter again, their voices grating against Mary's ears. She clenched her jaw but kept her cool. She had seen bullies like Blake before, people who thrived on making others feel small. But she had also learned that bullies only had as much power as you gave them. "I set the price. You want it cheaper, you can try your luck catching your own," Mary said, her tone as steady as the waves behind her. Blake leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But guts won't get you far when you're dealing with people like me." Mary met his stare, her expression unchanging. "Maybe not. But I don't plan on going far. I'm right where I need to be." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Blake seemed unsure of what to do next. His bravado was cracking, just slightly, under the weight of Mary's unflinching resolve. But he quickly masked it with another laugh, throwing the trout back onto the counter. "Keep your fish," he said, turning back to his bike. "Come on, boys. Let's find someone who knows how to show some respect." The bikers revved their engines, the deafening roar shaking the wooden planks of the pier. Mary watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't let it show, but the encounter had rattled her more than she cared to admit. As the noise of the bikes faded into the distance, the pier fell silent again. Mary let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the bikers had arrived. She looked out at the water, its calm surface a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed. But deep down, Mary knew this wasn't the end. Blake and his gang weren't the kind of people to let a small-town fisherwoman stand up to them without consequences. They would be back. And next time, they might not leave so easily. Underscore 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 on. The next few days passed without incident, but the shadow of the bikers lingered over Brookhaven. The townsfolk whispered about them in hushed tones, their fear growing with each passing day. Some suggested calling the police, but the nearest station was miles away, and the officers there were already stretched thin. Others talked about leaving town altogether, abandoning the lives they had built to escape the looming threat. Mary, however, refused to let fear dictate her actions. She went about her work as usual, mending nets, cleaning fish, and tending to her small shop on the pier. But she also kept a close eye on the horizon, watching for the first sign of trouble. It wasn't long before that trouble arrived. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, Mary heard the now familiar roar of motorcycle engines. Her heart sank as she looked up from her work to see Blake and his gang rolling into town once again. This time, they weren't alone. A few more bikers had joined their ranks, their numbers swelling to nearly 20. The gang parked their bikes in the center of town, their engines falling silent as they dismounted. Blake was at the front, his leather jacket gleaming in the fading light. He looked around, his smirk returning as he took in the fearful faces of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch. "Good evening, Brookhaven," Blake called out, his voice echoing through the quiet streets. "We thought we'd pay you all another visit. Hope you don't mind." No one responded. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant cry of a seagull overhead. Blake's smirk widened as he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "I see we've got a warm welcome," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But we're not here to cause trouble. We just want to enjoy the sights. Maybe have a drink or two. You've got a bar around here, don't you?" The townsfolk exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak. Blake laughed, turning to his gang. "Guess we'll have to find it ourselves. Come on, boys." As the bikers began to spread out, Mary stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "What do you want, Blake?" The gang leader turned to face her, his smirk faltering for just a moment. He hadn't expected her to confront him again. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your place, lady?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Mary didn't back down. "This is my place. And you don't belong here." Blake stared at her, his jaw tightening. The gang behind him began to murmur, their voices a mix of amusement and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like Blake might back down. But then, he took a step closer, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But guts won't save you when things get serious." Mary's heart raced, but she refused to let her fear show. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "We'll see about that." The standoff was broken by the sound of a police siren in the distance. Blake glanced over his shoulder, his expression darkening. "Looks like you got lucky this time," he said, stepping back. "But don't think this is over." With that, he turned and mounted his bike, signaling for his gang to follow. The roar of their engines filled the air once again as they sped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As the siren grew louder, Mary felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she also knew that the fight was far from over. Blake and his gang would be back. And next time, they wouldn't be so easily deterred. Brookhaven didn't sleep that night. After Blake and his gang had left, the townsfolk gathered in the small community center, their voices filled with worry. The single police car that had arrived after the bikers left hadn't done much to calm their fears. Officer Pete, the only lawman in the area, looked overwhelmed as he tried to reassure everyone. "I know it's scary," Pete said, holding his hands up to quiet the crowd. "But we can't let them run us out of town. Brookhaven is our home, and we've dealt with tough times before." Mary stood in the back, arms crossed as she listened. Pete's words were well-meaning, but they rang hollow. He wasn't equipped to handle a gang like Blake's. Mary could see the fear in his eyes, the way his voice wavered just slightly. She knew he was out of his depth. "What are we supposed to do, Pete?" an elderly man named Tom asked, his voice trembling. "They're bigger, stronger, and they don't care about the law. What if they come back with guns?" The room fell silent at the mention of guns. It was an unspoken fear, one that had been lurking in the back of everyone's mind. Brookhaven wasn't the kind of place where people carried weapons. Most of the townsfolk were farmers, shopkeepers, and fishermen, ordinary people just trying to get by. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Pete said, though his tone lacked conviction. "For now, let's focus on staying vigilant. Keep an eye out for anything unusual and report it to me immediately." Mary shook her head, her frustration growing. Waiting and hoping for the best wasn't a plan, it was a recipe for disaster. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the uneasy murmurs. "Waiting isn't enough," she said firmly. "We need to be proactive. Blake and his gang think they can do whatever they want because we're scared. If we don't stand up to them, they'll keep coming back, and it'll only get worse." All eyes turned to her, some filled with admiration, others with doubt. Mary had always been known for her toughness, but standing up to a gang was a different matter entirely. "And what do you suggest we do, Mary?" asked Sarah, the owner of the local bakery. "We're not fighters. We're just trying to live our lives." Mary took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: they couldn't afford to be passive. "We start by protecting what's ours," she said. "We can set up a watch system, take turns keeping an eye on the town. If we see them coming, we'll be ready. And we need to find a way to make them understand that Brookhaven isn't an easy target." There were murmurs of agreement, though some faces still showed doubt. Mary could feel the weight of their uncertainty, but she refused to back down. Over the next few days, the townsfolk began to put Mary's plan into action. Volunteers took turns keeping watch at key points around town, armed with nothing more than flashlights and radios. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mary spent her days working on the pier as usual, but her mind was always elsewhere. She thought about Blake and his gang, about their arrogance and cruelty. She thought about the fear in her neighbors' eyes and the responsibility she now felt to protect them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mary sat on her porch, sharpening a knife she used for cleaning fish. The rhythmic sound of the blade against the whetstone was soothing, a small comfort in the midst of her unease. "Mind if I join you?" a voice asked. Mary looked up to see Tom standing at the bottom of the steps, his hands in his pockets. He looked older than usual, the lines on his face deeper in the dim light. "Sure," Mary said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Tom sat down with a sigh, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're brave, Mary. Braver than most of us." "I'm just doing what needs to be done," Mary replied, her voice steady. "We can't let them push us around." Tom nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just hope it's enough. They're not like us. They don't play by the rules." Mary didn't respond right away. She knew Tom was right. Blake and his gang thrived on chaos, on exploiting the weaknesses of others. But she also knew that fear was their greatest weapon, and she refused to let them wield it over her. "We'll make it enough," she said finally, her voice filled with quiet determination. "One way or another." It wasn't long before the bikers returned, as Mary had predicted. This time, they came at night, their engines rumbling like thunder as they rolled into town. The watch system worked as planned, the volunteers spotted the gang as they approached and alerted the others. Mary was at the pier when she heard the call over the radio. She grabbed her knife and headed into town, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she arrived, the bikers had already begun their usual routine of intimidation. Blake stood in the center of the square, his smirk as arrogant as ever. "Well, "Well," he said, looking around at the gathered townsfolk. "Looks like you've been busy. A watch system? That's cute." Mary stepped forward, her knife hidden in her belt. "What do you want, Blake?" Blake turned to her, his smirk widening. "You're still asking the wrong questions, lady. It's not about what we want. It's about what we can take." The gang laughed, their voices echoing through the square. Mary's grip on her knife tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "This town isn't yours to take," she said, her voice steady. "We're not afraid of you." Blake raised an eyebrow, his expression amused. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, you all look pretty scared." He gestured to the townsfolk, who were watching from a safe distance. Some of them looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Others clutched makeshift weapons, their fear evident in their trembling hands. Mary stepped closer, her eyes locked on Blake's. "Maybe we are. But fear doesn't mean we'll roll over for you." For a moment, Blake seemed taken aback by her words. But he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." He took a step toward her, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. The tension in the square was palpable, the air thick with the possibility of violence. But before Blake could make his move, a loud noise broke the silence. It was the sound of a gunshot, fired into the air. Everyone froze, their eyes turning to the source of the sound. Officer Pete stood at the edge of the square, his gun raised. His hands were shaking, but his expression was resolute. "That's enough," Pete said, his voice firm. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or I'll arrest the lot of you." Blake stared at Pete, his smirk fading. For a moment, it seemed like he might call the officer's bluff. But then, he raised his hands in mock surrender. All right," he said, stepping back. "We'll go. For now." He turned to his gang, signaling for them to follow. As they mounted their bikes, Blake looked back at Mary, his expression dark. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Not by a long shot." With that, the gang roared out of town, their engines fading into the night. The square fell silent once again, the tension slowly dissipating. Mary let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at Pete, who lowered his gun with a shaky hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Pete nodded, though his face was pale. "Let's just hope they don't come back." The bikers kept coming. Day after day, they showed up on their roaring machines, filling the air with the growl of engines and their mocking laughter. They treated Brookhaven like it was their playground, their taunts aimed at anyone who dared to meet their gaze. Mary was often their main target. She stood by her stall on the pier, selling fish to the locals and tourists who still braved the town. The bikers circled her stall like vultures, throwing insults and pretending to knock over her buckets of fresh catch. But Mary didn't react. She stayed calm, her face unreadable, her hands steady as she worked. She didn't give them the satisfaction of anger or fear. What the bikers didn't realize was that her silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Every interaction, every sneer and insult, was like a puzzle piece, and Mary was putting it all together. She watched their movements, noted the way they carried themselves, the patterns of when they arrived and left. She listened carefully to their offhand remarks, picking up clues about their motivations. Blake, the leader, was the loudest and most arrogant of them all. His cocky smirk never wavered, as if he thought he was invincible. But Mary had lived long enough to know that people like Blake always had a weakness, a blind spot. And she was determined to find it. Unbeknownst to the bikers, Mary wasn't as vulnerable as she seemed. She had a secret weapon, one they would never expect. Her son, Luke, had returned to Brookhaven a few months earlier. To most people, he was just a quiet fisherman, like his mother. He spent his days repairing nets, hauling in catches, and keeping to himself. But Luke's past was anything but ordinary. For years, Luke had served in the Navy SEALs, one of the most elite and demanding military units in the world. He had trained for missions most people couldn't even imagine: rescue operations, covert strikes, survival in hostile territory. He had faced danger head-on, surviving where others couldn't. When he left the service, Luke had come back to Brookhaven looking for peace. He never talked about his time as a SEAL, and Mary never asked. But she knew what her son was capable of. She had seen it in the way he moved: quiet, deliberate, always aware of his surroundings. She had seen it in the way he fixed things, his hands steady and precise, as if nothing could rattle him. And she had seen it in his eyes, a quiet intensity that spoke of someone who had been to the edge and come back. Now, as the bikers continued to harass the town, Mary felt a flicker of hope. She hadn't told Luke what was happening, not yet. She wanted to handle it herself, to protect her son from getting pulled into more conflict. But deep down, she knew that if things escalated, Luke wouldn't stand by and let the town suffer. One evening, after the bikers had left, Mary sat on her porch, staring out at the dark waters of the bay. The air was cool, and the stars were just starting to appear in the sky. Luke joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You've been quiet," he said, handing her a mug and sitting down beside her. Mary took a sip, the warmth of the tea calming her nerves. "Just thinking." "About them?" Luke asked, his voice low. Mary glanced at him, surprised. "You've noticed?" Luke chuckled softly. "Hard not to. They're loud, and they're everywhere." "What's going on?" Mary hesitated. She hadn't wanted to burden Luke with this, but she also knew she couldn't keep him in the dark forever. "They've been causing trouble. Harassing people." "Harassing me?" Luke's jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened. "How long?" "A few weeks," Mary admitted. "But I've handled worse." Luke didn't respond right away. He stared out at the water, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "They're testing you." "Testing the town?" "Seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back." Mary nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of." Luke leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "What do you want to do about it?" "I'm still figuring that out," Mary said. She looked at her son, studying his face. "But I know one thing. I won't let them take this town from us." Luke nodded, his expression softening. "Neither will I." The next day, Mary overheard something that made her blood run cold. She was at the local diner, dropping off some fish for the cook, when she heard 2 of the bikers talking in low voices at a corner table. They didn't notice her as she passed by, her ears straining to catch their words. "Said the shipment's coming in next week," one of them said, his voice gruff. "Yeah, but we need to clear out these locals first," the other replied. "Can't have them poking around. Boss'll lose his mind if this deal goes south." Mary's heart raced. A shipment? A deal? This wasn't just about intimidation or territory. The bikers were planning something, and they needed the town under their control to pull it off. She left the diner quickly, her mind spinning. What kind of shipment were they talking about? Drugs? Weapons? Whatever it was big enough for them to risk drawing attention. Mary knew she had to act fast. If the bikers succeeded in their plan, Brookhaven would never be the same. That night, Mary sat down with Luke and told him everything. She told him about the bikers' harassment, about the conversation she had overheard, and about her growing suspicion that something much bigger was at play. Luke listened carefully, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "If they're planning something big, they're going to have backup. They'll be ready for trouble." Mary nodded. I know. But we can't just sit back and let it happen. Luke's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw the SEAL in him, the strategist, the fighter. We need to find out what they're planning and when. If we can disrupt their operation, we'll have the upper hand. Mary felt a surge of relief. She had always been strong, but having Luke by her side gave her a new sense of confidence. Together, they began to lay out a plan. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through Brookhaven. Mary and Luke sat at the kitchen table, a map of the town spread out before them. Mary had marked spots where she had seen the bikers linger, as well as areas she suspected they used for meetings. They seemed to like the stretch of road near the old mill, Mary said, pointing to a curve just outside of town. It's out of sight, and they could use it to store whatever shipment they're waiting for. Luke nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the map. If they're dealing with something illegal, they'll need a secure spot to load and unload. The mill's secluded, and the back roads make it easy to avoid attention. It's a good guess. Mary leaned back, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. But we can't be sure until we get proof. And we don't have much time. Luke tapped the map thoughtfully. I'll do some recon tonight. See if I can confirm anything. If they're using the mill, there'll be tracks, tire marks, or signs of recent activity. Mary frowned. You're sure about this? You've been out of the game for a while. Luke smirked, the faintest hint of his old self shining through. This isn't exactly enemy territory, Mom. I think I can handle a few bikers. Despite his confidence, Mary couldn't shake her worry. She knew Luke was capable, but the stakes were high, and she didn't want to risk losing him to this fight. That night, Luke slipped out of the house with nothing more than a flashlight, a sturdy knife, and years of training guiding his every move. The road to the old mill was quiet, the kind of silence that heightened every sound, a branch snapping, the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. When he reached the mill, he crouched low, blending into the shadows. The structure was just as he remembered it, weathered and crumbling, abandoned for years. But as he approached, he noticed signs of recent use. The gravel near the entrance was disturbed, fresh tire marks crisscrossing the ground. A faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air, and a few cigarette butts littered the dirt. Luke moved closer, his footsteps silent. He circled the building, searching for an entry point. A broken window near the back provided a clear view inside. What he saw confirmed Mary's suspicions. Inside the mill, a few bikers were gathered around a large crate. One of them was Blake, his familiar leather jacket catching the faint glow of a lantern. They were talking in low voices, but Luke couldn't make out the words. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos, careful to keep his movements slow and deliberate. Then he spotted something that made his stomach tighten, a small stack of weapons leaning against the crate, rifles, shotguns, and even a couple of pistols. This wasn't just a shipment. It was an arsenal. Luke returned home just before dawn, his face grim as he laid the photos on the table. Mary stared at them, her hands trembling slightly. Weapons, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. They're bringing weapons into Brookhaven. Luke nodded. It's worse than we thought. This isn't just about intimidation. They're planning something big. Mary's mind raced as she tried to process the information. The bikers' constant harassment, the shipment they had mentioned, it all pointed to a larger operation. But why Brookhaven? They're using the town as cover, Luke said, as if reading her thoughts. It's small, off the radar. Nobody would expect something like this here. But if they're storing weapons, they're either selling them or preparing for something worse. Mary felt a surge of anger. The bikers had already brought fear to her town, and now they were putting everyone's lives in danger. She looked at Luke, her resolve hardening. We have to stop them, she said. Before it's too late. Luke met her gaze, his expression serious. We will. But we need to be smart about this. If we go to the police, they might not take us seriously. We need proof more than just photos. Mary nodded. What's the plan? The next step was to involve the townsfolk. Mary knew that standing up to the bikers would take more than just her and Luke. They needed the community to come together, to show the gang that Brookhaven wasn't as helpless as they thought. At the next town meeting, Mary stood in front of the small crowd, her voice steady but urgent. I know you're scared, she said, looking at the familiar faces of her neighbors. We all are. But we can't let that fear control us. The bikers are planning something dangerous, and if we don't act now, it'll be too late. There were murmurs of concern, but also uncertainty. What can we do? Someone asked. They've got weapons. We can't fight them. Mary nodded. I'm not asking you to fight. But we need to show them that this town won't back down. We need to keep watch, gather more evidence, and make it clear that we won't be intimidated. Luke stepped forward, his calm presence commanding attention. They're counting on us to stay quiet, to let them do whatever they want. But if we work together, we can stop them. I'll handle the dangerous part. I just need your help to keep eyes on the town and report anything unusual. The room fell silent, the weight of their words sinking in. Slowly, one by one, people began to nod. The following days were a blur of activity. The townsfolk organized patrols, keeping watch at key points around Brookhaven. Luke continued his surveillance of the mill, gathering more evidence of the bikers' activities. Mary, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to keep morale high. She visited neighbors, bringing them food and words of encouragement. She reminded them that Brookhaven had weathered storms before and would survive this one too. But the tension in the air was palpable. The bikers seemed to sense that something had changed. They still came to town, but their visits were shorter, their behavior more cautious. Blake, in particular, seemed on edge, his usual smirk replaced with a look of suspicion. Mary knew it was only a matter of time before the bikers made their move. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bikers arrived in full force. Their engines roared as they lined up in the town square, their presence a blatant show of power. Blake dismounted his bike and strode toward Mary's stall, his expression dark. I hear you've been stirring up trouble, he said, his voice low and menacing. Mary didn't flinch. I'm just protecting what's mine. What's ours? Blake chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You think you can stop us? You're in over your head, lady. Mary met his gaze, her eyes steady. We'll see about that. Blake's smirk returned, but it was forced. He turned to his gang, shouting orders. The bikers began to spread out, their intentions clear. They were ready to escalate, to show Brookhaven who was in charge. But what they didn't realize was that the town was ready for them. The warm afternoon carried an eerie stillness as the bikers gathered in front of Mary, their laughter loud and grating. Blake strutted at the center, his confidence as obnoxious as the roar of their engines. To them, it was just another day of intimidation, another chance to flaunt their power in a town they believed too small to fight back. Mary stood at the edge of the dock, her hands resting on her hips. The wind tossed her hair, and her eyes, usually calm and quiet, gleamed with something new. Determination. Defiance. It was a gaze that seemed to cut through the biker's bravado like a knife. Blake noticed it, though he didn't fully understand it. What's the look for, lady? He jeered, leaning on his bike. You think you can take us on? Mary didn't respond. She simply stood there, unmoving, like a storm waiting to break. And then it came. A deep, guttural growl of an engine tore through the air, louder and more powerful than anything the bikers had ever heard. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground, shaking their confidence as easily as it shook the earth. The bikers turned, their laughter dying as they searched for the source. Blake's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't one of theirs. This wasn't a sound they controlled. And then he appeared. Luke, Mary's son, emerged from the haze of sunlight and dust, riding a sleek, black motorcycle that seemed more machine than vehicle. He wore his Navy SEAL gear, the insignia glinting in the light. His helmet shielded his face, but even from a distance, the intensity of his presence was undeniable. The townsfolk, who had gathered cautiously to watch from windows and doorways, gasped. This wasn't the quiet fisherman they thought they knew. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Luke dismounted the bike in one fluid motion, his movements precise and deliberate. He removed his helmet, revealing a face set like stone, his piercing eyes locking onto the gang. "Mom," his voice was low, steady, and sharp. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried an authority that silenced the world around him. "You should have told them who you were." Mary allowed herself a small smile, her hands dropping to her sides. "I thought they'd figure it out eventually," she said, her voice calm. Luke's gaze shifted to Blake, pinning him like a hawk sizing up prey. "But I guess they're slower than I thought." Blake's cocky demeanor shattered. He took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt. The bikers around him exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado fading in the presence of this unexpected threat. "You think you're scary?" Blake spat, trying to regain control. "You're just one guy." Luke didn't blink. "One guy is all it takes." The air seemed to crackle with tension as Luke stepped forward, his boots hitting the ground with measured precision. The bikers shifted nervously, their hands hovering over weapons. "Leave now," Luke said, his voice carrying an unspoken promise of consequences. "And I'll let you walk away." Blake laughed, but it was forced. "You don't tell us what to do, fisherman." Luke tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Fisherman? Is that what you think I am?" Before Blake could respond, Luke moved. It happened so fast that no one had time to react. In the blink of an eye, Luke closed the distance between them, grabbing Blake's arm and twisting it behind his back. The knife Blake had been reaching for clattered to the ground, and he let out a pained grunt as Luke held him in a vice-like grip. "Wrong move," Luke said calmly, his voice cold and steady. The bikers surged forward, but Luke was ready. He released Blake with a shove and turned to face the others, his movements fluid and precise. In seconds, the dock became a blur of action. Luke's training came to life in a way the bikers couldn't comprehend. He dodged punches and swung back with calculated precision, disarming one biker after another with ease. A kick sent one sprawling to the ground, a swift jab to another's arm forced him to drop his weapon. The bikers were larger, louder, and had the advantage of numbers. But Luke was faster, smarter, and utterly fearless. Mary watched from the edge of the chaos, her heart pounding. She had always known her son was capable of incredible things, but seeing him in action was like witnessing a force of nature. Blake, still recovering from Luke's initial strike, scrambled to his feet and grabbed a lead pipe from his bike. He swung it wildly, aiming for Luke's head. But Luke sidestepped the attack effortlessly, grabbing Blake's wrist and twisting it. The pipe fell to the ground with a metallic clang, and Blake let out a yelp of pain. "You picked the wrong town," Luke said, his voice low and menacing. As the bikers lay defeated, groaning on the ground, Luke turned to Blake, who was on his knees, clutching his arm. "Who are you?" Blake rasped, his voice trembling with fear. Luke crouched in front of him, his face calm but deadly serious. "I'm the guy you should have left alone." Blake's eyes darted to Mary, then back to Luke. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You don't know who we're working for." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe you should tell me." Blake hesitated, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "We're just middlemen," he stammered. "The real boss, he's not someone you want to mess with. The weapons aren't even ours. We're just moving them." Luke's jaw tightened. This was bigger than he'd thought. The bikers were just pawns in a larger game, and whoever was behind this operation had deeper roots than he'd anticipated. "Who's the boss?" Luke demanded, his voice like steel. Blake shook his head. "I don't know his name. We just call him the dealer. He's got connections everywhere, cartels, mercenaries. If you mess with him, you're dead." Luke stood, his mind racing. He had dismantled the immediate threat, but the fight was far from over. As the bikers fled, battered and humiliated, the townsfolk emerged from their hiding places. They gathered around Luke and Mary, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You saved us," one man said, his voice trembling. "No," Mary replied, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We saved ourselves. Luke just reminded us what we're capable of." The townsfolk cheered, their fear replaced with a newfound sense of unity and strength. For the first time in weeks, Brookhaven felt like a place of hope again. But as Luke stood beside his mother, his eyes scanning the horizon, he knew the battle wasn't over. The dealer was out there, and his reach extended far beyond this small town. For now, Brookhaven was safe. But Luke wasn't about to let the threat linger. "We've got work to do," he said, his voice resolute. Mary nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "And we'll face it together." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm glow. For the first time in weeks, the air was quiet, not with fear, but with the promise of a new beginning. As night fell over Brookhaven, Luke stood by the docks, gazing out at the darkened waters. The immediate danger had passed, the bikers were gone, their pride and power shattered, but Luke's mind was far from at ease. Blake's words echoed in his thoughts: the dealer. Cartels. Mercenaries. This wasn't just a local problem anymore. Whoever the dealer was, his reach extended far beyond Brookhaven. The shipment of weapons was just the tip of the iceberg. Mary approached quietly, her presence grounding him. "You're thinking about what Blake said, aren't you?" Luke nodded, his jaw tight. "This isn't over, Mom. The dealer knows about Brookhaven now. He'll send someone else. Maybe worse." Mary's face was resolute. "Then we'll be ready. We've stood up to bullies before, and we can do it again." Luke turned to her, his expression softening. "This is different. These aren't just bikers with a bad attitude. If the dealer's involved, we're dealing with organized crime. Professionals." Mary crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You faced professionals before." Luke let out a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, but I had a team then. Backup. Resources." He gestured around them. "Now it's just me and a small town fishing community." Mary placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm. "You're wrong. It's not just you. It's all of us. And you've got more than a fishing community. You've got people who care, who are willing to fight for their home. You've got me." The next morning, Luke and Mary called another town meeting. The air in the community center was tense but hopeful. The people of Brookhaven had seen what Luke was capable of, and their fear had been replaced with a sense of determination. "Blake and his gang are gone," Luke began, his voice steady. "But they were just a small part of something much bigger. The dealer, the man behind the weapons, won't stop just because we stood up to his crew." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "We don't know when or how he'll strike," Luke continued. "But we can't wait for him to come to us. We need to be ready." An older man in the back, Mr. Grady, raised his hand. "What can we do? We're not soldiers." Luke nodded. "You don't need to be. What we need is vigilance. Patrols to watch for unusual activity. Communication, so we can act quickly if something happens. And most importantly, we need to stay united. Mary stepped forward, her voice strong. We've faced hardships before. We've rebuilt after storms, supported each other through tragedies. This is no different. If we stand together, we can protect our home. The townsfolk exchanged determined glances. Slowly, hands began to rise in agreement. We're with you, one woman said. All of us, another added. Over the next few days, Brookhaven transformed. Luke worked tirelessly, organizing patrols and training volunteers in basic self-defense. He taught them how to identify signs of suspicious activity, how to work as a team, and most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. Mary coordinated efforts on the ground, ensuring that everyone had what they needed. She turned her small fishing stall into a hub of information, where people could report sightings or gather updates. The townsfolk, inspired by Luke's leadership and Mary's resilience, threw themselves into the effort. Farmers donated supplies, mechanics tuned up vehicles for patrols, and the younger residents helped set up a communication network using old walkie-talkies. Even Mr. Grady, despite his age, insisted on joining a night patrol. I may be old, he said with a grin, but I can still keep watch. While the town prepared, Luke focused on gathering intel. He knew they needed more than just vigilance, they needed information about the dealer and his operation. Using the photos he had taken at the mill, Luke identified markings on the crates that linked them to a shipping company based several towns away. With Mary's encouragement, he reached out to an old Navy contact, Jack, who worked in private security. Jack agreed to meet Luke in a diner on the outskirts of Brookhaven. The two men shook hands, their bond evident despite the years that had passed. You've got yourself in deep, haven't you? Jack said, glancing at the photos. Luke smirked. Wouldn't be the first time. Jack examined the images closely. These markings, they're used by a syndicate operating out of the port city. The dealer's known for moving contraband through small towns like yours. Keeps the heat off his main operations. Any chance you've got a lead on him? Luke asked. Jack shook his head. He's a ghost. But if he's using Brookhaven, it's because he thinks it's an easy target. You've already proven him wrong once. That'll buy you some time. Back in Brookhaven, the preparations were nearing completion. Patrols were running smoothly, and the townsfolk had settled into a rhythm of cautious optimism. One evening, as Luke and Mary walked through the quiet streets, Mary glanced at her son. Do you think we're ready? Luke hesitated. As ready as we can be. But there's always a chance things won't go as planned. Mary stopped and turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. You've done more for this town in a few weeks than anyone could have asked for. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Luke nodded, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. I just hope it's enough. The attack came just after midnight. The first sign was the sound of vehicles, large, heavy trucks rumbling through the outskirts of town. Then came the figures, shadowy and armed, slipping through the darkness like predators. Luke, who had been on patrol, spotted them first. He grabbed his radio and alerted the others. They're here. Everyone to your positions. The townsfolk sprang into action. Lights flicked on, and the makeshift communication network buzzed with updates. Patrols converged on the intruders, using their knowledge of the town to stay one step ahead. Luke led the charge, his training kicking in as he coordinated the defense. The attackers were well armed and organized, but they hadn't expected resistance. Mary, stationed at the docks, rallied the townsfolk, ensuring everyone stayed safe and focused. Despite the danger, her voice remained steady, her presence a beacon of strength. The confrontation escalated quickly. The attackers, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, became increasingly desperate. Shots rang out, and the quiet town erupted into chaos. Luke moved through the fray like a ghost, disarming opponents and guiding his allies. His years of training were evident in every move, every decision. At the docks, Mary faced her own challenges. A group of intruders had targeted the area, hoping to secure it as a landing point for their operation. But Mary, armed with nothing more than her wits and a heavy fishing rod, stood her ground. "You picked the wrong town," she told them, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. As the battle wore on, it became clear that the townsfolk had the upper hand. Their unity and determination outmatched the attackers' brute force. Luke confronted the leader of the group, a man who seemed to answer directly to the dealer. The fight was brutal, but Luke's skill and resolve won out. As the man lay defeated, Luke demanded answers. "Where's the dealer?" The man smirked through bloody teeth. "You'll never find him. But he'll find you." By dawn, the attackers had been driven out. Brookhaven stood victorious, though the cost was evident in the tired faces and the few minor injuries among the townsfolk. Luke and Mary stood side by side, watching as the town came together to clean up and rebuild. "We did it," Mary said, her voice filled with pride. Luke nodded, though his mind remained on the dealer. The victory was only temporary. The real fight was still to come. But for now, Brookhaven was safe, and that was enough. The last rumble of the fleeing bikers' engines faded into the night, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the soft lapping of the water against the dock. Luke stood tall, his hand still gripping Blake's collar. Blake's face was pale, his earlier cockiness replaced with raw fear. "You came to my town," Luke said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You thought you could intimidate my mother. You thought wrong." Blake stammered, his bravado completely shattered. I didn't know, man. I swear, I didn't know." Luke's grip tightened for a moment before he released Blake, letting him stumble back. Blake hit the ground hard, coughing as he scrambled to his feet. Luke took a step closer, his towering presence forcing Blake to back away further. "Here's what you're going to do," Luke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to tell whoever sent you that Brookhaven isn't an easy target. And if I ever see you or your crew here again," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The icy determination in his eyes said it all. Blake nodded frantically, tripping over his own feet as he stumbled toward his bike. "Why yeah, sure. You got it? We're done. We're gone." Luke watched in silence as Blake sped off into the night, his tail light disappearing into the distance. Mary approached Luke, her expression calm but tinged with pride. "You didn't have to do all that, you know." Luke turned to her, his face softening. "Yes, I did. They needed to know that you're not alone." Mary smiled, placing a hand on his arm. "I've never been alone, not with you around." The townsfolk, who had been cautiously watching from windows and doorways, began to emerge. Slowly at first, then in a growing wave, they gathered around Luke and Mary. "You did it," one man said, clapping Luke on the back. "They won't come back after this," another added. Luke shook his head. "This wasn't just about scaring them off. It's about making sure this town is ready for whatever comes next. The dealer might send more people. We need to stay prepared." The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier fear replaced with a newfound resolve. Mary raised her voice, addressing the group. "We've faced hard times before. We've rebuilt after storms, after losses. This is no different. Brookhaven is strong because we stand together. And now, we're stronger than ever." A cheer erupted from the crowd, the sound carrying through the night like a beacon of hope. The next day, Luke and Mary took the evidence they had gathered to the local authorities. Photos of the weapons crates, details about Blake's gang, and everything Luke had learned about the dealer were handed over to Sheriff Peterson. "This is serious," the sheriff said, flipping through the files. "We've been hearing about weapons shipments moving through small towns, but we never had anything concrete. This could be the break we need to shut it down." Luke nodded. "You'll need to move fast. If the dealer knows his operation here has been compromised, he'll try to disappear." The sheriff stood, extending a hand to Luke. "We'll do our part, but I have to say, you've already done more than we ever could have asked. Brookhaven owes you." Luke shook his hand. "Just keep my mom and this town safe. That's all I care about." In the days that followed, Brookhaven began to heal. The docks, once shadowed by fear, returned to life. Mary's stall was bustling again, the familiar rhythm of her work bringing a sense of normalcy back to the town. Luke stayed for a while longer, helping with the cleanup and keeping an eye out for any lingering threats. But as the days passed without incident, he knew it was time to move on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Luke stood by the docks with Mary. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Mary asked, her voice gentle. Luke nodded. "The dealer's network is bigger than just this town. I can't let this go. If there's a chance to stop him, I need to take it." Mary sighed, a mix of pride and sadness in her expression. "You've always been like this. Even as a boy, you couldn't stand by when something needed fixing." Luke smiled. "Guess I learned that from you." Mary reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Be careful, Luke. You've done more for this town than anyone could have imagined. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." As Luke rode out of Brookhaven, his mind was already on his next move. Blake's mention of the dealer's connections provided a trail to follow, and Luke intended to see it through. Back in town, the sheriff and his team, armed with Luke's intel, launched a coordinated operation. With the help of federal agencies, they raided warehouses and intercepted shipments linked to the dealer, unraveling the syndicate piece by piece. Blake's gang, captured during one of the raids, provided additional information in exchange for reduced sentences. The dealer's empire, once thought untouchable, began to crumble. Word of Brookhaven's stand against the bikers and the syndicate spread, inspiring other small towns to take a stand. Luke's actions had sparked a movement, proving that even the smallest communities could fight back against larger threats. Months later, Mary's life had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The docks were as lively as ever, and the scars of the past had begun to fade. But every so often, she would look out at the road leading out of town, wondering where her son was and what battles he might be facing. One evening, as she was closing up her stall, a familiar sound reached her ears, the low, powerful hum of a motorcycle engine. She turned, and there he was. Luke, dusty and tired but alive, pulling up to the dock with a small smile on his face. "Thought I'd stop by," he said, dismounting the bike. Mary's heart swelled as she embraced him. "You're always welcome here, Luke. This will always be your home." As the sun set over Brookhaven, casting the town in a golden glow, mother and son stood together, their bond stronger than ever. The fight had been hard, but justice had been served, and Brookhaven was safe once more. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the waters of Brookhaven. The town, though battered, had regained its sense of peace. The fishermen returned to their nets, children played along the streets, and the faint hum of life resumed in the small, close-knit community. Mary stood at the edge of the dock, the salty breeze tugging at her hair. Her gaze rested on the vast expanse of water stretching before her, the waves lapping gently against the wooden posts. The chaos of recent days felt like a distant memory, but the lessons it brought lingered in her heart. Mary thought about everything that had happened, the bikers, the fear, the tension, and how it had all unraveled. She had faced people who thought power was about noise, aggression, and control. But she had shown them something else. Power, she realized, wasn't in the fists that slammed or the threats that echoed. It wasn't in the engines that roared or the gangs that swarmed. True power was in knowing who you were and what you stood for. It was in standing firm when others tried to knock you down, in remaining calm when the world turned chaotic. Mary smiled softly, thinking of Luke. Her son had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, had seen things no one should ever have to see. And yet, he had returned to her, not as a broken man but as someone who understood that strength came not just from muscles or training but from heart and purpose. Brookhaven was different now. The scars from the bikers' reign of terror remained, but they were a testament to the town's resilience. The people of Brookhaven had found their courage in the midst of fear. They had learned to stand together, to protect each other, and to refuse to be bullied. The small town, once quiet and overlooked, had become a symbol of unity. Stories of their stand against the bikers spread, inspiring neighboring communities to take pride in their strength. Visitors came to the docks to hear the tale firsthand, drawn by the courage of a small fishing town that refused to be silenced. Mary knew that her role in the story wasn't just about enduring, it was about leading by example. Her quiet strength had shown her neighbors what it meant to stand firm in the face of intimidation. And in Luke, she saw her own lessons reflected back. As the sun sank lower, casting fiery streaks across the horizon, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was grateful for her town, for the people who had stood beside her. She was grateful for Luke, who had come home not just to fight but to remind her that she was never alone. But most of all, she was grateful for the chance to prove that no matter how small or quiet a person might seem, they could hold within them the strength to move mountains. Luke's words echoed in her mind, sometimes it's not about who's loudest. It's about who stands tallest. That lesson stayed with Mary, and she carried it with her as life returned to normal. Each day brought its own challenges, broken nets to mend, fish to sell, and storms to weather. But she faced them all with the calm assurance that she was ready for anything. Brookhaven wasn't just her home. It was her foundation. And she knew that as long as she stood strong, the town would stand with her. The people of Brookhaven took those lessons to heart. They built stronger connections, watched out for each other, and grew more confident in their ability to handle whatever came their way. The docks were livelier than ever, not just with work but with laughter, conversation, and the bonds of a community that had rediscovered its strength. Even the children, who had watched their parents and neighbors stand against the bikers, seemed to carry themselves with a new sense of pride. They would grow up knowing what it meant to protect what mattered, to stand for something bigger than themselves. Luke stayed for a time, helping the town rebuild and watching over his mother. But he knew his journey wasn't over. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he packed his bag and prepared to leave. Mary stood at the doorway, watching him with a mix of pride and sadness. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice soft. "I do," Luke replied. "The dealer's network is bigger than just this town. If I can stop it from reaching other places like Brookhaven, I have to try." Mary nodded, understanding. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Luke smiled, his voice steady. "Always." As Luke rode off into the distance, Mary stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared from view. She didn't feel sadness, not really. She felt hope. Because Brookhaven had shown her that no matter how dark things seemed, light could always find its way through. It wasn't about being fearless, it was about facing fear with determination. It wasn't about being the strongest, it was about standing strong together. Mary returned to the docks, her place in the world. The sea stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of both the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. As she worked, she noticed a young girl watching her from a distance. The girl, no more than 10, hesitated before approaching. "Miss Mary," the girl asked timidly. "How did you do it? How did you stay brave?" Mary knelt to the girl's level, her voice gentle but firm. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. And it's about remembering that you're never alone. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. As the girl ran off to join her friends, Mary stood and looked out at the sea once more. The waves rolled on, constant and unyielding, a reminder of life's endless challenges. But Mary knew, as surely as the tides would rise and fall, that she and the people of Brookhaven would always rise to meet them.